Any others? Your reflections on Sunday. You know, one of the things that I thought about was we've had many to transition. So to see Miss Jo Butler without Dr. D.R. Butler, to not have Mrs. Ethel Lee with us, or to not have Mr. Ely with us, or to not have Isaiah Dupree with us, so many others whose names I cannot call at the moment, whose presence we felt. And I want to mention that. Any others, your reflections on Sunday?
Well, I was happy to be there. And as Marcia said, we missed the drapings. And first thing I looked at was the cross. And I thought about Gary Jones climbing up on that ladder every year, trying to drape that cloth the way that it should be. But we had the spirit there. I really enjoyed that first song, just really brought everybody up. I think everybody wanted to shout hallelujah because we were inside the church. And that song just kept us buoyed up. For me, it was great to see Betty Jo, because I talked to Satira and I saw this lady standing there and I thought, I've seen her somewhere before. And where have I seen her before? Then I had to come back and say, aren't you on our Noonday Bible study? And it was, it was great. So being able to see Miss Speaks and Janelle and all of those people that we haven't seen in 2 years, it was a good feeling. Even elbow bumping. Yes, so I enjoyed being there. You did a great message, Pastor. You really did. So
thank you, Dr. Bowden.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you all. It really was great. And I want to thank you all for your flexibility in the registration and all the new stuff we're doing. We will continue to monitor and do what we think is necessary to protect you, to protect your health and safety, to protect the church from, any legal stuff. So all of the things that we are doing, they are to protect us all and protect the church. So I thank you for your willingness to be flexible. It means a great deal and makes a big difference. Let's pray. Gracious and Holy One, on this Easter Wednesday, we thank you. We thank you that death does not have the final word. We thank you that yours is a yes to human beings and not a no. We thank you that you allowed us after 2 years, over 2 years, to return to the sanctuary. And it is such a strange thing, because in the history of this church, the two churches that became Metropolitan Israel and Union churches, there is nothing in our history like these 2 years outside of worship. And what is strange, God, now this is really strange. I was really hesitant at the beginning of this period, did not know what ministry would look like, did not know what we would be able to do. Very concerned about the health of ministries, the health of our outreach, the health of our justice work, and the financial health of the church. But in the second year of the pandemic, you gave us the best year that we have ever had. And we thank you. You are a strange God, and your ways are strange. You connected more people with us when we were not physically present than when we were physically present. And we think it's because your spirit has been with us, has blown upon us, has blessed us. Now we would ask that you would continue to lift us, encourage us, strengthen us. We pray for those who are here gathered. We pray for those who are carrying in their hearts situations, people, pain, issues, challenges. We give them all over to you, because as has been said time and time again, you do all things well. Now, as we move into these ancient words. Help us to learn what they say to us today, how they reveal the truth of who you are, the truth of who we are, and what we're called to do in this moment. Forgive us, bless us, lift us, heal us, join us together. In the name of the risen Christ, we pray. Amen. Now, I asked you all to read a little bit of Leviticus, and what I'm going to do is just so that our space would be seasoned by those words, I'm just going to go and ask you to join with me. Leviticus chapter 2. I'm just going to read a few verses just so that we can hear and feel Leviticus chapter 2, beginning of the first verse. When anyone presents a grain offering to the Lord, the offering shall be of choice flour. The worshiper shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest. After taking from it a handful of choice flour and oil with all its frankincense, the priest shall turn this token portion into smoke on the altar, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. And what is left of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons, a most holy part of the offerings by fire to the Lord. When you present a grain offering baked in the oven, it shall be of choice flour, unleavened cakes mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers spread with oil. If your offering is grain prepared on a griddle, it shall be of choice flour mixed with oil, unleavened. Break it in pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your offering is grain prepared in a pan, it shall be made of choice flour and oil. You shall bring to the Lord grain offering that is prepared in any of these ways, and when it is presented to the priest, he shall take it to the altar. The priest shall remove from the grain the priest shall remove from the grain offering its token portion and turn this into smoke on the altar, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. And what is left of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is the most holy part of the offerings by fire to the Lord. No grain offering that you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you must not turn any leaven or honey into smoke as an offering by fire to the Lord. You may bring them to the Lord as an offering of choice products, but they shall not be offered on the altar for a pleasing odor. Now, a couple of questions. What do you hear here that reminds you of what we have read previously? It says here, you shall not bring to the Lord, no grain offering that you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven. Where do you think that comes from?
Passover.
A reminder to the people of what? You're exactly right.
That they had to leave in a hurry.
That they had to leave in a hurry. And the hurry speaks to the fact that so many pressures were upon them. Now it says that you can't turn that into smoke on the altar, but you can bring it as an offering of choice products. Did you know that? So it is not an offering pleasing for the nostrils of God, but it can be brought. Now, here's another thing. What did it keep saying about the kind of grain and flour you should bring? It should be what kind of grain and flour?
The best.
Yeah, your best.
The best, the choice. Now, look at Exodus, Leviticus chapter 1, verse 3. Verse 3 says, Leviticus 1:3, if the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you shall offer a male without what?
Blemish.
So what are you seeing here as you compare and contrast the kind of grain and flour and the kind of livestock offering? They both should be what?
Perfect.
The best.
Perfect and the best. Now, why perfect and the best?
Because the priests are going to eat that.
The priests are going to eat that, but even beyond that, I think more importantly, it is important to eat. But why?
Because it's sin-free.
Say it again.
It's supposed to be something that represents being sin-free of sin.
Something free of blemish and some choice.
It's a sacrifice.
It's a sacrifice. Right. And to whom, Brother TJ?
To the Lord.
To the Lord.
God.
And what do we want to give?
Want to give out
Forgiveness. Forgiveness.
And so, Brother TJ, let me ask you this. Why do you think the best is continues? So choice flour, choice grain, livestock without blemish. What's this about?
If it is not your best, it doesn't mean very much. I mean, if it's blemished, I can give you that, and it's not a sacrifice on my part.
Now you it's interesting. How many of you have noticed the price between fresh bread and day-old bread?
Mm-hmm.
Fresh bagels and day-old bagels. When I was in college, I ate quite a few day-old bagels. Or when you go to buy clothing, you see there's some clothing that's discounted because it's irregular, right? The zipper is not quite right. The button's not quite in the right space. The difference if you're going to buy a car, in a brand new car and they don't call them used car anymore. What do they call them? Pre-owned, gently used, whatever.
Certified used.
Certified. We come up with all kinds of things to call it. But there is, and I think that let's expand the question for these people trying. So you notice how the story continues to be woven. So you got the Exodus story of them leaving in a hurry, but then it says you can't bring an offering to God to be burned on the altar unless it is of unleavened bread. You see how the story keeps weaving itself. Even in Leviticus, which people pretty much don't get into because they think it is boring and filled with rules, but there's more to it. It continues to weave in a ritual way the story that is important to the people, because those who had heard the story, when they hear unleavened bread, what happens? Same thing. What happened to your ears when you heard unleavened bread? What happened to your ears? You thought what?
Thought Exodus.
Right, you thought Exodus. I've heard this before. So without blemish and choice, and as I said, it feeds the economy system because the priests would eat the meat and the priests would use the flour. But it also says here, if you go back to Leviticus 1:7, I don't want to lose what the authors read when we think about these sacrifices. And I don't mean to be graphic, but for us to consider, well, I think I do mean to be graphic, or I wouldn't say it, that this is bloody business. Ankles and blood. You smell burning flesh. You hear animals bleeding, making noise. You hear, so if you look at Leviticus 1, verse 5, the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord. How many of y'all have ever seen the slaughtering of an animal, participated in slaughtering an animal? I've done that. Who wants to share? Brother Summers, I saw your hand. What's it like?
I used to go down in the rural area where my father's folks were, and they would have hog killing. And everyone in the family had a job. I remember seeing them, and it's kind of queasy, so bear with me. They would shoot the hog in the head, and then they would take one of these big hammers and hit them in the head again to make sure they were dead, and then they would skin them and quarter them and put different kinds of meats together. And the ladies, they would carve the fat out and then give it to the ladies, and they had this big fire going, and they would put it in a bucket, and they would melt down the lard and all that. And then they would have this stuff called crackling, and you just pick that up and eat it. It was, I was a little kid, so I thought it was fun, but I don't think I'd like it now.
But, hey, Chuck, when you left out the part where they had that big black pot for boiling water that they
Yes.
used to take the hair off the hog,
Right,
and they'd hang him up,
right.
To bleed him.
bleeding.
Yep. Dr.
Well, you've been there too, huh, TJ?
Oh yeah, my grandmother had a big farm, and we'd go down every year around Thanksgiving, and all my uncles and the whole family would come down. And as Charles said, everyone had a job with regard to killing of the hog. So
Now, Brother TJ, let me ask you a very simple question, and it just shows how these things go. Why do you butcher the hog at Thanksgiving and not on the 4th of July?
you do it in the wintertime because you don't want it to spoil.
That's right. Exactly right. Exactly right. And what my father would say, now I went to one, but I missed when they were growing up. He said they would take it and then they would hang it in the smokehouse. And that he said that his grandfather fixed a contraption of aluminum. So you hang the meat from the top of the smokehouse, but you place these pieces of aluminum that come down about 5 or 6 inches, so that if rats tried to climb tried to jump from the beams to eat the meat, they would slide down off of the aluminum and not be able to get to the meat. Just very practical stuff, because if you had all those mouths to feed, I mean, it was fun, but they ate that for the rest of the year. Some of them, they as you said, they wasted no part. Dr. Bowler, what do you remember?
I was remembering going to Morocco with my godparents, and as we got outside, what was the slaughterhouse, I guess, where they prepared the lambs for sheep, for leather coats and all of that stuff. And the tour guide gave my godmother and myself and my godfather a bouquet of flowers, and my godmother said, "Oh, this is so nice." But not realizing that as we stepped inside that wall, all of the blood that was on the floor and the animals, as you said, the lambs beaten and the men in their boots and half naked and preparing the lambs for slaughter to make, and she couldn't stay there. She just had to run out. But we walked through, my godfather and I just thought when you said with the priest, with all the blood and everything, I could just imagine that same thing happening there as I was walking through that slaughterhouse. Yeah.
And I think that because we have been so far removed from that kind of production, we just think that, we go to the store and pick it up, but they're still, they do it in a much more industrial way, but those living animals wind up in those white styrofoam things with, I'm calling it saran wrap, but with some form of plastic. That's not the way it works in the real world. So with that thinking, Leviticus chapter 1, the bull, verse 5, Leviticus 1:5, the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord. Now, this is interesting because probably in Morocco, Dr. Bowling, and I'm guessing, but it's probably right. That was probably a halal slaughterhouse where they butcher the meat according to the law of Torah, of not the Torah, y'all, the Quran. So they butcher the meat according to the laws in the Quran and in the Muslim tradition. And here, each culture, and this is something that I don't want to rush past. When it says the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord, there was an intrinsic belief that these beings were holy, these animals were holy and a part of God's creation. And before, in the halal tradition and in the Jewish tradition, they pray before they take the lives of these animals. They thank God for the lives of these animals. And part of honoring the animal sacrifice is they don't waste any part of it. So the bristles that Brother TJ mentioned, people use that to make hairbrushes, right? The lard and the fat, they would use to fry stuff. They make what we would call skins, crackling. They take the head and make head cheese. They would take the hooves, as I heard my grandfather say, and make tea. Like they literally didn't waste anything. He said as a little boy in the 20s and the 30s that his mother, whom I knew, whom we called Big Mama, would take the hooves from the slaughter and put water and boil it, and the kids would drink hog hoof tea in the morning. And of course, this is somewhat hyperbolic, but he said they never got sick because what's interesting is, and science says, is that a lot of the ways that pigs fight infection is through the hoof, because stuff can enter their bodies through their hooves. And so the hoof has some type of anti-whatever properties, right? And so it's all of this wisdom that they had that I think many of us may have lost. I know I don't have that wisdom. So the bull is slaughtered before the Lord, understanding that the slaughter itself was not seen apart from the ritual. It was to slaughter these beings made by God mattered and required the presence of God. Think of now about how we abuse the earth and creatures. We don't think about it in that way. And that's a problem for me, because if these creatures go away, we're in trouble. So the bull slaughtered before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall offer the blood. And you all know also the blood itself. People in many cultures make blood sausage. Y'all have heard of blood sausage, right? They congeal the blood, they smoke it, so they don't waste anything. Dashing the blood against all sides of the altar that is at the entrance of the meeting, tent of meeting. So when you went into the religious spaces, you would see the dashed blood. The burnt offering shall be flayed and cut up into parts, very much like people slice cuts of meat. The sons of the priest Aaron shall put fire on the altar and arrange the wood. So the priests are working. They are eating, but they're working. They're cutting the wood. They're dashing the blood. The Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the parts with the head and the suet on the wood that is on the fire of the altar, but its entrails and its legs shall be washed with water. Then the priest shall turn the whole into smoke on the altar as a burnt offering, an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord. If your gift for a burnt offering is from the flock, from the sheep or goats, your offering shall be a male without blemish. It shall be slaughtered on the north side of the altar before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall dash its blood against all sides of the altar. It shall be cut up into its parts. Again, repetition. With its head and its suet, and the priest shall arrange them on the wood that is on the fire of the altar. But the entrails and the legs shall be washed with water, and it's going to be turned into. So one of the things I think about, and then we'll move. Do y'all know people that like to barbecue, like to grill? Like, to me, I put all these things together. Notice the pride of people who grill, right? Notice those who have made art of it, and know that these things are ancient. So to me, when I see people grilling, the few times that I have attempted, not very well, to do it myself, it's a part of a longer human tradition. And human beings in ancient cultures did not just consider these animals as beings to disrespect, but they respected them when they took their lives. They respected them when they prepared them, and they respected them by offering grace before they consumed them. So part of what people say is this relationship between humans and animals, humans who eat animals, has been a relationship of respect. And when you read through, those of you who were able, the first 3 chapters of Leviticus, what else stuck out to you? Just very briefly before we move forward. What grasped you as you read?
How graphic it was.
You say very, very graphic, huh?
Very graphic, very graphic.
Say a little more, Sister Marcia.
Well, I was glad that I read it after dinner and not before. It was just, it's absolutely gross by our standards, but you know,
I call it yucky, Marcia. I call it.
You muted yourself, Janine.
Okay. I thought it was yucky. I mean,
Yeah.
ah.
Yeah, there's a lot of blood, a lot of chopping, and then
throwing it all around
yeah,
on the walls. I mean, I guess I'm just too Presbyterian. You know what I mean? Just to think about blood all over the place. And what are the horns on the altar?
The horns of the altar, if you just Google that phrase, horns of the altar, you'll get images.
Okay.
I can, give me 1 second. Let me share screen and I can show you something. But yeah, I think it's important for us to not clean this up, right? That's why.
Yeah.
So Sister Barsha, you said it is not a good pre-dinner reading.
No, not at all.
All right, so I'm gonna try to bring this image up. Give me 1 second here. I'm sharing screen. Here we go. So here you have pictures of the horns of the altar. So as you see right here, here's a good one. Let's see if I can. Do y'all see that? You notice those 4 things on the corners that look like animal horns? Those are the horns of the altar. You see those? So you got an example here and examples here, different images of what it may have looked like. That's a good question. Yep. So anyone else in your reading, what did you think?
Pastor, I had trouble with the transition.
Okay.
From Exodus to Leviticus.
Oh, good question.
And what I mean by that, you hear this term wandering, and they're being fed manna because they don't have anything else. And now all of a sudden, these wandering people have herds and fields of grain and so forth. That's, I just got, momentarily, I got caught up in how did this happen so quickly in the transition?
That's a good point. So we do know, and thank you, Brother Summers, this helps, that they were nomadic because they had the tent of meeting. All of these things occurred in the tent and near the tent of meeting. And so they were in spaces where they also still did have herds. So very much like and many of you have traveled much more extensively than I have, but you have seen nomadic people who keep herds, who keep sheep, who keep goats, who may keep oxen or other forms of larger cattle. And so they still had that. And this is a demanding thing because another tie, Brother Summers, is this, and I hope this makes sense. In order for American citizens to be indoctrinated in the mythologies of America, every year the 4th of July rolls around. And every year during that time, if you were a teacher in school like Dr. Boland, or like Sister Linda, or students in schools like everyone here today, that story was retold to you, right? In church, in school, on television, through movies. And so I think of Leviticus very much as the ritual that makes the story come alive. So in the saying, you bring these sacrifices, it's reminding you of what God has done and our duty, your duty to return some form of thanksgiving, gratitude, sacrifice, but also when you move in the direction of, don't offer as a fragrant offering the unleavened bread. So you see, it's very interesting. Not only do you hear the bleeding of the animals and the priests wading in blood, the butchers, the wood choppers, all that stuff. And notice, everybody that's doing that labor is a priest. So you all don't ask me to chop wood or butcher meat. But all of that stuff was considered to be the job of a people set aside. And the understanding was that God's presence was somehow connected to the ritual. And to be honest, we still believe that. I still believe that people are ritualized folks, whether you are churchy or not, whether you are doctrinaire or not, we still have our rituals. We have cultural rituals. Graduations are rituals. Baccalaureates are rituals. Wakes are rituals, whether you do them in a bar or you do them in a church. All of these things are rituals. And does this make some sense, Brother Summers, that Leviticus ritualizes the story and makes it such that the people can remember? Hold your thought, Janine. Does that make sense, Brother Summers? I'm trying. Right. Yeah. Sister Marion, go ahead.
Well, I'm probably the only one, but I found, and this might have been discussed, I had to go downstairs and let a guest in, but I had trouble reading this. I found it kind of tedious, and I really wasn't all that interested in these rituals.
Well, no, I'm glad that you say that. And I'm glad that, I mean, you're being honest about the way that you saw it. And I think that it's important to have that dialogue. I mean, she begins by saying people don't want to read this. But I think to understand the people and to understand how those who became Christians read this and how this still influences us. So one of the things that is said in the Holy Week readings of the sacrifice of Jesus, his blood be on us and all our children, right? Those who wanted him dead. And so there's no way for faithful Jews to hear that without hearing and remembering this type of sacrificial system. Or when we talk about union in our reality, when we talk about the body and blood of Christ, Christians have drawn, a lot of people, a lot of theologians whom I respect think we should even have communion. Think that the ritual itself reignites a theological belief that God requires suffering. Another theological problem that I have, because I do not believe that God requires suffering, but it's written into a lot of who we are. So there's a lot of struggle. I think that God speaks in and through suffering, but I don't think that God requires suffering. I think very much that Buddhists and Christians are talking similarly when they talk about suffering being a part of the human condition. That doesn't mean that God demands it. So I don't think you were the only one, Marion. A lot of people find this tedious. Now let's I want to move through this.
I'd like to add one thing.
Yes, go ahead.
It seemed to me it was kind of democratic, because no matter what you brought, it was treated the same way. You know, whether it was doves or, you know, grain or whatever, that it was the same valuable to God, whatever it was.
No, thank you for saying that. And even one of the reasons we know that Jesus's family was poor is because in Luke, it says that how do we know? What offering did they bring? They brought what? Pigeons, right? That was the offering of the poor. If they had money, they would have been bringing goats or larger cattle. So that spoke to their socioeconomic condition, but everybody was required to bring something. And in that day, because the temple was extant, what they would have done is taken Roman currency, traded it into temple currency, because you could not buy. So many of them, it would not have been practical coming into Jerusalem to bring your offering with you. So they sold offerings in the temple complex. But the reason Jesus got angry is they jacked the price up, because you could not spend Roman currency in the temple complex. Why? Because what was the problem with Roman currency? It had what?
It had Caesar's face on it?
Right, it had images on it. It had images on it, and you could not use currency. So if those of you who've been to Israel, raise your hand. And I've got some Israeli money around here somewhere. It's been a long time, but none of their currency has photographs on it. It doesn't have a picture of anybody, right? So because of the cultural reality. Now, let's go to the bottom of page 49. Inheritors of this religious tradition cannot ignore the centrality of sacrifice. The reason we're spending time here is because we cannot ignore the centrality of sacrifice. Sacrifice is a ritual acknowledgement that God requires holiness, right? And by holiness, remember that God requires that we be set apart, that we live a different reality. Ritual provides a way for the community to approach the holy. There may be flexibility in implementation, but the embodiment of reconciliation is required. The challenge before contemporary Judeo-Christian communities is to determine the equivalent of sacrifice to bring about reconciliation to the whole world in the present time. What rituals should inheritors of this tradition engage in that are specific and detailed while inclusive and flexible? So part of this, I say, is we do not, and I was going to spend more time here, and let's just take a little bit of time as I prepared. We don't do this stuff anymore. So we have had to think, as Judy Frenchis Williams writes here, what does sacrifice look like in our day? So what the modern church, the modern temple talks about is the sacrifices of what is valuable to us. The sacrifice of money to take care of the church, the temple, the synagogue, the mosque, the sacrifice of time in service, the sacrifice of time in study, right? So here is something that is very important. All of us deviate from practices in the books that we call holy. So then the question is, from what do we deviate? And what do we still hold as sacrosanct? So people are not bringing doves and goats and pigeons and oxen to church, but people are bringing themselves, their money, their time, and the church is to still teach and preach sacrifice as we approach the holy, so that we are still conversant in some way with that tradition. But we also know that Leviticus speaks to other realities. Now, let's go to Leviticus 18.
So can I ask you?
Go ahead, but Carlos, go ahead.
Offering a well-being, exactly what is the well-being? I understand this.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I would need to do more work. My memory tells me that is a communal offering for health, for general health of the community. And really also, they're talking about the health of the animals that support not only their economics, but their nourishment. So well-being offering would be that, to center the health of the community and all that made possible the community's shared life. That's a good question. Okay. Any other questions?
Pastor, can I, you were talking, a good question. What does a modern sacrifice look like? And, we're such a non-religious culture now. We really aren't, I think we're very secular. It's very materialistic. It's very here and now. It's very, and I'm describing me. And so I think that was one of the things that made, for me, reading Leviticus, the first part anyway, so difficult. It was like, well, that's not me. That's not us now.
Mm. No, I think you're right. And I think then it requires what you do as a lawyer, even though you may not be practicing now. You are an exegete. You read texts for a modern application and interpretation. So that's what we're called to do. That's why we can't pitch this out. We've got to ask ourselves, what then is the spirit of the ancients that were practicing these things? And I think what was good for them is good for us in our contemporary moment, trying to figure out where it has contemporary resonance. And so, I think that's our shared work. It's part of the work of setting aside this time to try to figure out what sacrifices are we called to make for the greater good. Now, here's another piece. It's been raised by Janine and others. Leviticus ritualizes the story of the people, but Leviticus also centers, there is a justice lens where people are to be treated fairly. And those who are scholars of this stuff teach us, including Wilda Gaffney, another extraordinary scholar of Hebrew Bible, who writes that the people named as Israel were diverse. There were all kinds of people gathered into this group, multiple nations. So let me give you a reading here really quickly. Let's see. I'll find it again, but essentially what it talks about is that, here it is. Given the plural, multicultural nature of the people assembled under the name Israel, it would be a mistake to read the social equality of partners in ethnic, national, or racial terms. One of the things that I need to remember is that The people called Israel were plural and multicultural, right? They're plural and multicultural. And so we have to think, because we are plural and multicultural. Even a church that's majority Black or majority white is still plural and multicultural. All of us from different backgrounds and having different ways of seeing the world. Now, Leviticus also speaks about sex and sexuality, a huge part of what it means to be a human being. So Leviticus 18:22, I want to take you there, where you'll read these words. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Now, this is one of the texts that people use to say that our homosexual brothers and sisters have no part in God's holiness and shouldn't be a part of our community. So what Judy Finches Williams writes here at the top of page 50, there's been a long and contentious dialogue in communities of faith around how or if this teaching prohibits homosexuality. The prevalence of this debate must be held alongside the recognition that there are many prohibitions in Leviticus that faithful people ignore unapologetically. So that's the first thing. Anybody who says, oh, Leviticus says, ask them, did they eat a cheeseburger last night? Ask them, do they eat shrimp? Ask them, are they wearing polyester, right? So she said the first problem with that argument, where it breaks down, is to say, this is the thing, and to ignore all the other things that we ignore is a problem. If you're with me, thumbs up. Y'all with me so far, right? Okay. So it is proof that some rules matter more than others, and that the hierarchy of rules may be a better indicator of our own culture and religious context than of God's priorities. That's a great sentence, isn't it? That what we think is important may say more about us than it says about God. The overarching theme of Leviticus is holiness is for everyone. It calls all people, not just priests, to holy living, which means God's people are known not just by how they worship, but by what they abstain from and what they do. Ritual in the place of worship creates an order that imprints on the people in the form of ritualistic or ethical behavior. Now, this goes back to what you were saying, Brother Summers. What is all that? How does this fit together? Well, not only does the ritual remind us of the story, but the ritual intends to shape our ethics, how we live together. So if you come to a place every day that says, thou shalt love, every week that says, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, you're not just talking. The people who put that together are trying to say, this is how you live. So the ritual draws you to the story, but it also knits and weaves together our ethical ways of being together. Does that make sense? And so Judy Finches Williams is dropping all manner of bomb here by saying to lift this up and not the other stuff speaks to a lack of integrity. You lift it all up or some of it, or you say there's stuff that's important to us and there's stuff that's not. So the people whose religion is built around using Leviticus 18:22 to cut out our brothers, our sisters, our sons, our daughters, our grandchildren, that's on them. Then we got to ask ourselves, what then are we doing? How are we lifting up stuff and erasing some stuff? And what is behind that with us? So this Leviticus 18 lists forbidden sexual practices and forbids sacrificing children to the Babylonian god Molech, followed by negative consequences for disobeying. Leviticus 20 forbids sacrifices to Molech, lists forbidden sexual practices, followed by the positive consequences for obedience. So not only is this stuff about sacrificing, I wonder if, is it more interesting to read 2 chapters about sex? Who knows? But Marion said yes, more interesting to read about sex than sacrifice. Maybe so. I think that we're selling more books about sex than about animal sacrifice, but but it hits on all parts of what it means to be human. So the structure invites a dialogue between 18 and 19. 19, it says, is a central summons to holiness. So we read 19 last week, but it goes back to the Decalogue, keeping Sabbath, prohibition of idols. Now let's move a little bit more to the sexuality piece. Francis Williams says two helpful things. One, that the ancients understood sex, not completely, but a lot of their understanding was around sex and fertility. So the order, this is on page 51, the prohibition in 1822 reflects a world order that reaches back to the creation story in Genesis. The order God establishes includes the prime directive of the creation to be fertile and multiply. Remember, that's God's first command, be fruitful and multiply. So part of this is an understanding by the ancients that sex that does not procreate is kind of challenging in their worldview. Now, we all know there is a lot of heterosexual sex that is not about procreation, and there is homosexual sex that is not about procreation. But what she says is these were people who were thoughtful around keeping creation moving through sexual activity. In this world, procreation is an anticipated product of sexual activity. For this reason, sexual partners and occasions are regulated to optimize fertility and to protect the family. Now notice, these regulations were issued to a male. It says, thou shalt not lie with a male as with a woman. Whoever's writing this is not writing it to women, because they don't say you shall not lie with a woman as with a man. You notice that? It's writing, as she says, to men. And so what she also reads here is interesting. What she thinks is most likely saying is, these regulations were issued to a male audience, which helps explain the wording of the prohibition with the man as you would with the woman, an idiom used for homosexual acts by heterosexuals, most likely in a family unit. So her reading is, this is forbidding a man in a house of having sex with men in his household, his sons, his nephews, his grandchildren, or his slaves. What it is arguing against is you should not do that with men in your household. And what she's arguing here is the command preserves an emphasis on procreation and it regulates power. It's also saying to the men who control households, you cannot use your power over men in your household sexually. But here's a problem. It does not prohibit the use of women sexually in that way. So this is what we got to understand, that this is culturally driven. And so we're not going to solve this problem, but we also are not going to pretend like it's not here. What does Leviticus 18:22 mean? And for those of you for whom this is important, because you want to think about it, because the people you love who are gay, who are same gender loving, and you want to think about what this means, do more research, because there's a whole lot. You will find people who will say the worst things, and you'll find people who will say loving things. So let's move on. And Leviticus 20:10. If a man commits adultery with a married woman, committing adultery with a neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be executed. Now, y'all, according to statistics, that means that more than half of us would be dead, would be dead. So our number of 22 today would go down to about 9 or 10 if we did this. So for those of us who say, Bible says, gay people going to hell, but then ask them about Leviticus 20:10 and see who creeps out of the room very quietly. So the issue here, she says, is not if adultery is an offense, but it is concerned with the severity of the punishment. And here's the thing. Notice what she says, the adulteress may have been raped by the adulterer because the woman could have been overpowered. And so it talks here about if the husband wanted mercy, he could appeal to the king. There was a way out. The editors of Leviticus are taking the concerns for government and community shared by their tribal neighbors and casting them differently to eliminate the role and centrality of the king In the final form of Leviticus, law and punishment, is administered by God. In the absence of the king, the inheritors of this text must decide who will interpret and administer the punishment. And there's an interesting background. Remember in John 8, where Jesus encounters a woman who they say has been adultery. What does Jesus say? Jesus says, where's the dude that did this, right? Because he's like, all right, if y'all want to execute the law, let's execute the law. See, I love that because he knows and they know that this says both die. And he intervenes. And this is why Jesus ended up on that cross. He talked too much. Anyone minded his own business. And he was ticking off the religious folk and the political folk. So he enters into the fray and he says, no, where's the one she's been with? Those where he wrote something in the ground. Remember, John doesn't tell us what he wrote, but he wrote some stuff and they all went home and said, let he who's without sin cast the first stone. Now this goes back to this executing both parties. And so later on, the community has to determine who has authority to interpret this. And in our culture, we are much less willing to say, I have the authority to interpret it. We are a lot more gun shy than former generations. Mary, your hand was up, go ahead.
You once talked about Leviticus 18 as 22, as really talking about rituals or acts performed in
yeah, so there is also readings more so in when Paul talks about what we interpret as. So this is what interpreters say, that the kind of same-sex relationships that we see today were not the ways that ancients thought about homosexual sex. So what I have read, and there's probably new study about this, new scholarship, was that men who had sex with men were not considered homosexual in many ancient cultures. That men who had power over men would have sex with them, and it's just what people did, right? It was so if I'm a wealthy man and I've got slaves or poor people that work for me, it was not unusual for those men to have sex with those other men, and nobody thought they were gay because that was not a thing. Paul talks about the ritualized homosexual activity that was a part of some religious traditions in the first century, where a part of the sacrifice ritual was temple sex. And sometimes that meant men having sex with men or women having sex with women. I mean, there are a couple of things. The same way that we are much more squeamish about blood on the floor, we also tend to be much more squeamish about talking about sex than these earlier cultures did. It was a much different reality. And so you're right, Mary, and I have mentioned, and what I would encourage you all to do is there's a whole lot of books out there for those who want to get a deeper read of what these things are saying. And a lot of what people are saying, one person's book is disagreed with by another person's book. So it's an ongoing conversation. I think what's most important for us is for those who bang on Leviticus 18:22, they don't bang on Leviticus 20:10. And so my question to you is, if you're banging on it, why are you banging on it? Why is this the thing that is the word of God and this thing is not? Those are the ethical, intellectually honest questions with which we must contend. You all have survived an hour-long discussion about Leviticus, and you are to be commended. And it's not as bad as it looks. It's not, I mean, I think Leviticus is better than Brussels sprouts. This is for me. I still ain't gonna eat no Brussels sprouts. So what we'll be doing is moving, even the ones you all prepare on your grill with your meat, I'm still not gonna eat it. But chapter 4 is Numbers. And I want you to read chapter 4. We move to Numbers. We'll start next week by dusting off Leviticus to see if you all have any remaining questions. But I want to thank